about something. I got all these Turkish sort of accounts sending me stuff. There was one guy who just repeatedly sent me pornography of animals having sex with. So I don't know. It was very hardcore. And so I used to go down the feed, and there was that guy. And I didn't even block him, actually, because I sort of thought, well, somewhere in Turkey, he's a really angry man, desperately finding horse pornography to send to me. And in a way, I felt so sorry for him that was how his life had come, the end his life had come to at this stage, that I couldn't even block him. And also he'd be like, I'm the donkey porn guy who got blocked by Douglas. He'd get a certain fame.
What was his motivation for sending you this stuff?
It was because, well, the short story is a couple of years ago, the Turkish president tried to get the German chancellor to imprison a German comic for a very rude poem he'd read on air on German television that was insulting about the Turkish president. And the German authorities actually started a case against the comedian for insulting the Turkish president, Erdogan. And I decided to launch an offensive poetry competition to offend the Turkish president. And there was £1,000 cash prize. And it sort of took off. And in the end, the now Foreign Secretary entered and won.
What?
Yes.
Really?
That was great, yes. It was really good because at the same time that the Germans were looking at imprisoning a comedian, the now Foreign Secretary of the UK was guilty of precisely the same alleged crime, i.e. meaning it wasn't a crime, it couldn't be a crime. A couple of other people did. A wonderful Dutch comedian friend, Hans Janssen, sort of did a similar thing at the time. He decided to do an interview live on Dutch television explaining how much he hated Erdogan because he still owed him money from the blowjob he'd given Erdogan in a sauna. And it was live on Dutch television. And the Dutch authorities were they were asked if they would prosecute him. But anyhow, but this was, I had a great time with this, of course, and I wrote a limerick explaining how abusive I wanted people to be about Erdogan, that it was necessary to be highly defamatory, and you wouldn't get away with it if you just called him a wanker or something. So I wrote the opening verse and invited the world to contribute, which they did. And it became, among other things, the highest paid poetry competition in the world. If like me, you wrote a limerick, just 5 lines, this is £200 a line. I mean, no poetry magazine could pay you for such work. So anyhow, on the basis of that, I became very, very unpopular in Turkey. And there were many pieces talking about how this gay, atheist, terrible Erdogan hater in Britain was exactly what we were up against. So him and his poems.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So the German government was actually considering prosecuting this guy. How far did they take it?
He was taken in for questioning, I know. He had to retain lawyers. I'm fairly sure they did only drop it in the end because of the international attention that was paid to it. There was this law on the books that still said, it was a lèse-majesté law about offending foreign rulers. And he had done it for such an important reason as well, which was to say, we in Germany should have the right to be rude about Erdogan, particularly Erdogan, who, was promoted from mayor to prime minister, now to president, wants to be sultan. He's a very bad man, locked up more journalists per capita, I think, than any other country in the world, other than China, which I don't think we can get the stats on. A very, very evil, I think, man who has led his country backwards in the last 20 years and is in the process of trying to destroy a wonderful country. And if you can't be rude about him, if you can't pretend that he sleeps with animals, which is what the German comedian started with, then somewhere down the line you won't be able to say anything about the imprisoned journalists either, and so on. And since also, by the way, people don't seem to spend much time worrying about the Turkish journalists that Erdogan imprisons, the least they paid attention when I said that he and Angela Merkel got up to really filthy acts in the zoo.
Well, obviously, the worst case of retaliation for humor is probably Charlie Hebdo, right? I mean, which is a terrible. And unfortunately, many people weren't defending the murder, but were talking the murderers. I mean, I think how many? I think it was 11 people were murdered.
Yeah, and a policeman
and a police officer. But they were saying that instead of concentrating on the murder, which was done completely out of this reinforcing their rules of their ideology and retaliation for any mocking of that ideology. Instead of that, they were talking about how racist Charlie Hebdo was.
Yeah.
There was a lot of that. In fact, my friend Jamie Kilstein was a part of that.
Right.
He was on television back in his super social justice warrior days talking about that.
Don't you wish, among other things, that people said, no, I'm not talking about something if they don't know about it?
Yeah.
You know, my guess was that until the murders, I mean, an infinitely small number of people knew about Charlie Hebdo outside of France.
Right.
I found myself in the wake of that in studios with people who I know had just Googled Charlie Hebdo the day before. I know that they'd just gone to Wikipedia and read an English version of a claim about what that magazine was about. It goes back to that thing about my point about the journalist and the Holocaust denial thing, that just root around. A bunch of people have been killed. This doesn't seem to vindicate my side's ideology. Therefore, let me find what I can do to defame them. And, oh, good, somebody at Charlie Hebdo once did this cartoon that was off colour, and I can't understand what the words are beneath it, but I'll claim it's racist. I mean, people were actually doing that.
Yeah.
There was one cartoon that was used against Charlie Hebdo after the massacre that was a joke against the Front National and the claims they were making about a black woman in the Sarkozy government. But because the joke and if you didn't speak French, it wasn't clear, apparently. And if you knew nothing about recent French history, you knew nothing about the Sarkozy administration and the minister in question, these people just went to it and said, racist cartoon, not noticing that the cartoon was actually a joke about racists. But they didn't bother to find that out. And I thought that whole thing, among many, many other things, was deeply worrying from that point of view, because it means that in the immediate aftermath of something that should be so damn clear, a bunch of people can just try to reframe the narrative.
Yeah.
And change the history of a publication.
Yeah.
Claim it is just something different. And for a lot of people, of course, that was very convenient, because after all, if Charlie Hebdo's staff actually were these racists, then you didn't need to worry too much about them or why you'd been silent on the issues they'd spoken up about.
Yeah, the narrative had then been that these people had been mocking this disenfranchised, marginalized group in society, and that they had it coming.
Yeah.
In some very strange way. And it's, boy, part of me struggled with that, because I was like, is this... Some people just have contrarian instincts. Everybody's going left. Sure. They just go, well, I don't like it, and they want to go the other way. There's so many people that have that instinct. And then there's, as you said before, this headline mentality. They read the headline and don't look any further into it, even if it's a headline about a headline.
Right.
That's all they need. They're armed with enough facts. They slam their laptop down and start debating.
Yeah. And in that case, as in many others, totally lose sight of the only thing that matters. The only thing that matters in that case being, is it ever right to make apologies for people walking into an office and gunning down people for an opinion you don't like? The answer to which has to be, of course, no.
Has to be.
Has to be no.
Yes.
And yet, in these moments, so we had one 20 years before with the Rushdie affair, the Satanic Verses affair. In these moments, you discover you don't have the allies on your side you thought you did. In the wake of the Rushdie affair in '89, it was people from the right and the left in Britain who started making excuses for the Ayatollah. We had the chief rabbi then of the UK, Jacobowitz, to his shame, said both Mr. Rushdie and the Ayatollah have offended people's feelings. As if Salman Rushdie had called on all novelists to go to Tehran and assassinate the Ayatollah if they had a chance. You had somebody like a right-wing conservative minister, Geoffrey Howe, who said that Rushdie had really offended Britain. He'd been rude about Britain, as if that had anything to do with anything. There was one famous case of a conservative peer who said about Rushdie that it wouldn't bother him if a group of young Muslims took Mr. Rushdie into an alleyway and taught him some manners. And you had that from the left as well. Bernie Grant, a Labour MP, famously said at that point that burning books wasn't a problem for him. And that was when they were burning the Satanic Verses in Bradford.
Yeah.
So you get these weird coalitions of people who suddenly turn out not to get the point, not want to defend. And then, of course, you get the cowards who say things like, well, it wasn't my sort of novel. You know, I didn't think the novel was all that good. Midnight's Children I could cope with, but the Satanic Verses, he lost me with a plot. As if that means that then you can call for the death of the author rather than just give it a bad review.
How is he now? Is Salman Rushdie still in hiding? I know he does a lot of interviews now, and it seems to be more relaxed.
Yes, he seems to be. I don't know the specifics. There was an assurance, I think, given some years ago in the Labour government that with Tehran that they would not actively encourage the murder of Rushdie anymore.
How nice.
How nice of them. That's a freezing of relations, or unfreezing of relations. But you know, the point I wanted to make was that's again we've been through these things. We know how it plays out. With the Charlie Hebdo events, the murder of the staff and the contributors to that magazine, we knew in the immediate aftermath what was going on, and that there were people who just wanted to make excuses, and you still hear that everywhere. I mean, I've heard it on every single free speech debate in my adult life. I remember the Rushdie debate when I was growing up, and I remember in every one of the things in recent years, from the Danish cartoons to the Jules Medina scandal, where a publisher in London was firebombed for publishing a novel that was actually amazingly fawning about Mohammed, to Charlie Hebdo, and since you just get this strange group of people from right and left, some believers, some non-believers, who always just come up with these bullshit arguments and say things like, well, I didn't find the cartoon very funny, or I never took that magazine seriously, or I didn't think it was right when they did this. And they just don't, for some reason, have the fortitude to just say the only thing that matters in the wake of that, which is no.
Do you think that's because Islam is unique in their approach to anything that goes outside the lines of what they feel is
absolutely
acceptable? I mean, in terms of like, they will murder you if you draw Muhammad.
Yeah, this is what's been described as the internalization of the fatwa. If I'm sure you've had this experience, but it's actually worse now. The presumption is worse than the actual reality. I have quite often people saying to me, "No, I'd like to write this piece about X, but I don't know if I can because I might get a death sentence." And actually, I always say, "What are you talking about? Write it." Fortunately, so far, I haven't given that advice, and the person's then been in any way under any actual danger, let alone being killed.
Right.
And I think I might feel differently if that was the case. But there is an overcompensation occurring at the moment, and it goes far within the boundaries of what actually could plausibly get you into any trouble, whether or not the trouble is legitimate to get into or not. So that now, I've had many journalists in recent years, particularly since Charlie Hebdo, sort of sidle up to me and say, "Well, I'd quite like to do this, but I don't dare." And I'm talking about for like very basic reporting and things. They're not people saying, "Hey, I've decided to draw a great big cartoon of Muhammad with a great big dick and having sex with the Pope or something." It's not that. It's never that. It's never people saying, "I'm really just so keen to draw Muhammad today, Douglas. What should I do?" It never is that. It's always something way, way, way down. I'm thinking of even like saying something critical of certain regimes. So So the internalization of the fatwa since 1989, which has been exacerbated now by the killings at Charlie Hebdo and elsewhere, and the attacks on the Jyllands-Posten in Denmark, means that we are in this period where people are really hypersensitive, and they really shouldn't be, because it really isn't that bad. It's not as bad as they think. But this is, you can do so much work if you say to people, I've got Kalashnikovs on my side. I mean, the extent, and people in free societies like ours are really, really loath to admit this, but it's the classic sort of mob trick, knocking on someone's door. I'm very disappointed in you, but my friend here, my huge friend, is really angry, and I'm just holding him back. You can do an amazing amount of work if you're willing to pull that kind of trick. And if you can persuade people, and it's actually the case that there are people you're holding back, you can make enormous inroads like that.
Well, especially when there's actual evidence that people have been murdered and have been...
Absolutely.
One of the more fascinating things about Charlie Hebdo to me was the refusal of any of the mainstream media to show any of the cartoons.
Yes.
You had to go online. And I felt like this was they gave up the reins of information to the internet.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was a real transitionary moment in our culture.
Yeah. Yes, everyone went online to see what they...
Yeah.
I mean,
it's the only place to go.
Apart from your parents, I mean, they were still under the impression that these must be, incredibly pornographic cartoons that were really, really viciously attacking somebody. But no, anyone young could find this out for themselves. And you're right, they gave up the space to the net. And they all had, again, these sort of rubbishy arguments of their own about it. I tried in Britain to get the press to do it at one go, a couple of days after the massacre, and got pretty close. That if everyone, sort of I am Spartacus tactic, if everyone did it at once, then it would be okay, or it would make it easier. And the argument you always get about that is, and it's a very persuasive argument, is that the editor of the magazine or newspaper might get protection and so on. But, a girl from the typing pool sort of thing. Mm. And which is what happened actually in some of the Satanic Verses killings and stabbings and things. It's like the Norwegian translators, Japanese translators. It's people who under no security protocol could possibly end up all getting protected. And on the basis of fearing that, the boss almost always says no.
One of the more uniquely American responses to the Charlie Hebdo attack was they had a Draw Muhammad contest in Texas.
Yes, I followed that.
Yeah, that was fascinating. And some guys showed up and started shooting at the building, and they were killed almost immediately.
Yes.
Which is because they're in Texas, and that's just not the place to fuck around.
True, although, I mean, it's worth mentioning that, I mean, the editor at Charlie Hebdo had police protection in Paris, and they just, I mean, I suppose they're not worth dwelling on, but I mean, the battle-trained people who were sent from Yemen to carry out that operation were better prepared than the French authorities realized.
Well, but very few people are really ready to militarize cartoonist offices.
Yes.
I mean, and that's really almost what you would have to do. You would have to have, Navy SEALs with bulletproof vests,
and then
locked and loaded.
And then, let's face it, I mean, the whole thing, then you do start to question, well, is this cartoon that funny? And so on.
Yeah.
And that's what they actually have done at Charlie Hebdo. They have... They did it a while ago, say, look, we're not going to keep doing this.
Well, didn't they have Muhammad making out with someone like almost immediately afterwards?
Yeah, immediately after, that's right, yeah. But after about a year or so, they stopped. They said they didn't want to do Muhammad again, and you can't blame them. I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? I'm sure you have this experience, but in these sorts of times, I always get people apart from the Turkish donkey porn guy, other people on Twitter send me things like, well, why don't you draw Muhammad? Sort of stuff.
Sure.
And first of all, I mean, I'm not a cartoonist, but secondly, the way in which this is always presented is amazing, because it's always from like Xena Warrior Princess 1293. You don't have the guts to draw Muhammad, Murray, and I'm like, well, you don't even have the guts to have your own name on Twitter, mate. So. but there's a bit of egging along
Yes.
that happens in those cases.
Well, I don't want to draw Muhammad. I don't want to piss people off by drawing the cartoon. But what I do want to point out is that if you don't defend people's rights to draw things without getting murdered,
Yes.
then you're living in an insane society.
Yeah, and then there's another thing, which is we all know what comes next. I mean, my point about this has always been, think of something smaller than a cartoon to do.
Right.
Okay. I mean, I still reserve the right to be amazed that we call something a cartoon crisis and keep a straight face.
Right.
Our whole,
Yeah.
we're going to have to militarize in Garland, Texas, because there's a cartoon crisis going to erupt,
the natural progression could easily be you're not allowed to draw the cartoon. Then from there, you're not allowed to speak of drawing.
Right.
And then from there, you have to show that you have a very certain idea in your head of what is good and what is bad. So you have to show that by verbalizing something. So you're forced to
Right.
forced to verbalize something.
And let's face it, it's not as if it's just the cartoon that's the problem, is it? I
Right.
mean, it's a novel, it's
Sure.
and so on and so forth.
It's anything.
And that's one of my big beefs about this is that I don't want to not say what I think is true. And even if that does offend, 1.3 or 4 billion people, as is often said in tones that are not entirely unthreatening, if Charlie Hebdo or somebody else can't draw a cartoon of Muhammad, then I know that exactly in tandem with that is somebody saying, and you, Douglas, or you, Joe, or you, or anyone else, can't say what you find in the texts or what you think about this religion, and you can join the rest of the society in being brave and going to the Book of Mormon on a Friday night for a laugh, and it is a laugh, but don't you dare think of applying to Islam the same kind of speech that you would apply to Mormonism.
Right.
And that I won't do. I just won't join in on that. And despite there being a price to pay for that, but I just won't not say what I think is true in these matters.
Are you aware of what they did with South Park? South Park, it got very crazy, where they not only could not draw Muhammad, they couldn't draw Muhammad in a bear suit. So then they had to have Muhammad in a bear suit in an armored car. So you couldn't even see him, but it was implied that Muhammad was inside the armored car in a bear suit, and still.
But they did Muhammad's voice, didn't they? Muhammad went, hello.
Yeah, they gave him a screwy voice.
Screwy voice. So that was okay. As long as you joke about the voice of Muhammad, you're okay. But don't you dare show him.
It's fucking insane.
But and it's really weird as well because actually, again, they all make presumptions. It's just not true. It's not true that nobody ever drew Muhammad. It's not true. There are illustrations in books that are still on sale of very old illustrations of Muhammad throughout Islamic history.
That's before they knew better, bro. They didn't know better. They got a new note from Muhammad. Muhammad was like, look, I don't like these fucking drawings of me.
They're not at all.
Cut it out.
Yeah.
Cut it out or I'll start killing people.
They don't show my best side. And but this is a very strange position to be in because South Park ends up holding the line. Then South Park gets weirdly it's like fatwa against South Park.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't see that headline coming. Yeah. And again, everyone internalizes and everyone thinks, well, I admire them in their Mormon work, but not sure I'd follow them in their Muhammad work. So, and then the whole culture tilts.
Right.
And that's I think where we are at the moment on this. And I've just the cartoon will never be funny enough, the joke will never be funny enough, the novel will never be good enough, and so on. And then in the end, the speech will never be worth speaking enough. I a little while ago had a very clear experience of this. I read about it on the radio in Britain where I was in a discussion with a Muslim cleric who's a sort of reformist figure and I admire in some ways, who in a discussion about something said, well, also Muhammad, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he took criticism in his own life. He took criticism very, very well. He never minded people criticizing him. And I was like, that's absolute crap. That is real crap. I mean, whatever else you can say, Muhammad not really good on the criticism of himself bit. And I gave an example of a female poetess who he had killed because she criticized him. And this guy went absolutely apeshit and refused to continue and so on. And
because you gave an actual
because I gave an historical example from his own religious texts. And in the end, it was a pre-recorded, and in the end, the BBC were like, Douglas, can you find another way of trying to make the same point? And, you know, and that was what we had to do. I mean,
wait a minute, another way of making the same point, rather than pointing out the historical text that showed that Muhammad did have a female poet killed.
Yes.
What other way would there be to make that point? It was
hard.
But that's the ultimate way to make that point.
Exactly, which is by pointing to the texts and the facts. But, you know, I can think of no other situation in which somebody has veto rights like that in a normal discussion.
And it's because they're terrified of the retaliation.
Yes, I mean, I knew everyone in the production box was like, oh no, what's Douglas done? And how can we stop it affecting us?
What was this cleric's response to that?
He went, as I say, a bit nuts and wouldn't continue unless I, you know, wouldn't say that. And so...
But what, did he deny that it was in the text?
Oh, yeah. Said I was making it up and I was a liar. I'm used to that.
But that's a crazy thing for him to say when someone could just read the text.
Yeah, but they're banking on nobody doing that.
Well, not in this day and age. Don't bank on that.
We will make America great again.